Hello, welcome. Thank you for joining us today. We'll get started just a few minutes after the hour. Thanks for joining. We'll get started in another minute.
Okay, I think we're going to get started. We still have people joining us. Um, Let me wait one more minute. We still have a bunch of people coming in. So, okay, I think we'll get started. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you're joining us from. Thank you very much for joining us for this 2024 State of the Science webinar. We are going to talk about the State of the Science report, which discusses environmental effects of marine renewable energy. Someone says they can't hear anyone speaking. Uh, any thoughts on that? Are others hearing? Others, some can hear and some cannot. Hmm. Uh, any thoughts, team?
Check your own audio setting on Zoom. It's coming from your end if you cannot hear us.
Does someone want to put that in the chat for those that can't hear? Great.
That person can now hear, so we're all
Oh,
good.
wonderful.
Yeah.
Okay, wonderful. Okay, great. With this many people on board, there's bound to be a few issues. Okay, hi. I'm Andrea Copping with Pacific Northwest National Laboratory and representing OES-Environmental. Welcome to this webinar on the 2024 State of the Science Report, which deals with environmental effects of marine renewable energy. I am here with my talented colleagues from Pacific Northwest National Laboratory and will be sharing this presentation. Next slide, please. Just a few background rules. Everyone will be muted today during the webinar and question period. There's just too many people to have live questions. We will be answering questions. Please use the question and answer box, which is somewhere or other on the screen to ask questions. You can start writing questions in any time. The chat will be active, but it'll be used if you need help with Zoom or you want to share some resources with everybody. But please put your questions in the question box because that's the ones we'll answer. We will be recording this webinar and we take your participation as consent. And the recording will be available later on Tethys. We just got some more people coming in. Boy, oh boy. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, our agenda today is very short. We are going to very briefly introduce OES-Environmental, and then we're going to spend all our time walking you through the 2024 State of the Science Report. There are 11 chapters of it, which you see laid out there. We'll then answer questions, and that is the cover of the report. Next slide, please. So OES-Environmental, this is a task under the International Energy Agency's Ocean Energy Systems. Ocean Energy Systems, or OES, is a collaboration of 25 countries plus the European Commission who have come together to promote and oversee responsible marine energy development. In 2010, they allowed our group to start this OES-Environmental initiative. And our remit is to examine environmental effects of marine energy in order to advance the industry in a responsible manner. It's led by the US, with the US Department of Energy's Water Power Technologies Office in the lead, and is implemented by our laboratory, Pacific Northwest National Lab. We are just finishing up phase 4 of this initiative, and at the moment we have 16 countries involved, and you can see their flags down there. So nice broad group. So, okay, next slide, please. As I mentioned, there are 11 chapters in the State of the Science Report. They're all laid out here. That QR code will take you directly to TETHIS, where you can download the State of the Science Report. You can also download the executive summary in 8 different languages, and what we call our short science summaries, or 2-pagers, which address many of the topics you'll hear about today. So we're going to dive right in and just start through these chapters. Next slide, please. So starting with chapter 1, this is really sort of the introduction, sort of laying out marine energy and ocean energy systems environmental. Next slide. So I think the real key point is we need to understand environmental effects of marine energy if we want to support the responsible development of the industry. We also need information on environmental effects to help accelerate consenting, also called permitting, and deployment. And this is because the uncertainties around environmental effects have held up many, many projects. They've made them longer, more expensive, and so on. There are many benefits to marine renewable energy, and I think most of us are aware of them, but this is the opportunity to create a sustainable, predictable, and low-carbon energy source to add to many national portfolios. It provides a new source of power at sea and for coastal areas that we really haven't tapped up to now. And offshore wind has its place, and so does marine energy. There is the potential for jobs and other kinds of development in many coastal areas, some of which are quite remote from other sources of income. And we're beginning to learn that when you have a lot of devices out there, they may act as refuges for many animals. Refuges create a reef effect, create de facto marine protected areas. But there's lots of challenges to deploying marine energy and to measuring environmental effects. We put these devices in the very energetic areas of the ocean that are not well understood, the very high waves, the very fast tidal currents. And we have a lot of uncertainty about how animals and habitats may be affected. And many of the animal species that we worry about are already under stress from other activities, including anthropogenic activities, but also climate change. The catch-22 here is we need more devices in the water so we can learn more, but it's difficult to get devices in the water with a great deal of regulatory uncertainty, environmental uncertainty. And while we are currently working on small numbers of devices, we really need to understand how our knowledge will scale as we go to larger commercial arrays. And we'll address that a little later too. Okay, next slide. So moving on to chapter 2, this is where we've really tried to get a pulse on of what is happening in terms of environmental effects measurements around the world. Next slide. So around the world, most of the projects have consisted of single devices, and there's very few number of small arrays of 4 to 6 devices. They are clusters, you can see from this map, largely in the UK, in Europe, the Americas, and Australia. The vast majority of these that have been deployed have been demonstration projects or they've been deployed at test sites. There are a few small arrays that have been and single devices that have been grid connected. We looked at environmental research and found 86 projects for which a substantial amount of environmental information had been gathered. And most of that research has really focused around collision risk, the potential for animals to run into turbine blades, effects of underwater noise on animals, effects of electromagnetic fields, largely from power export cables, and changes in both benthic and pelagic habitats. We found that it appeared that the greatest number of assessments occurred where there were species of concern, so endangered species or habitats of concern, and or where many other marine users were active. This is becoming a crowded ocean space, and so we've needed to, learn more about it. Next slide. We included 5 case studies for which we felt there was enough information to do some analysis. 4 of them are from the UK and Europe, tidal and wave, and 1 river one from Alaska and the US. And we looked at the studies that happened and what the outcome of those studies were, and what management or regulatory activities took place because of that information. And you'll just have to read about those in the report. No time to do into it today. Next slide. So from this set of looking at what's happened around the world, we've come up with some basic recommendations. It appears baseline assessments are almost always needed, particularly if you're going towards a commercial array. It's important that the potential risks be identified early so you can design effective post-installation monitoring plans. Collaboration is really one of the really key elements here. It's important that researchers can collaborate with the industry to work around their devices, that regulators work with both the industry and researchers to understand what data are needed for regulatory processes. And this is the opportunity to really bring stakeholders in to get them to understand and become very sort of comfortable with these devices and these projects. There's a real need to support open access data, putting data up, environmental data up on open platforms, and really ensure that everybody has the same look, the same transparency of data for decision making, and also so we don't reinvent the research wheel. There are a lot of tools and guidance available. We've got a lot of them listed. You'll find them throughout this report and later on this webinar. OES-Environmental, TETHIS, if you're in the UK, ORGEP is a great source of information. There is a true need to engage early and often with local communities. This has become clearer and clearer as an essential part of ensuring that the communities are not only willing, but really enthused and understanding and have a sense of stewardship over these projects, that they reflect their needs and values. And finally, there is a real need for methods for data collection, analysis, storage, et cetera, to be comparable. It's probably a stretch to say we're going to standardize methods in environmental work. It's a really big leap from the engineering side, but we do need to try to strive for comparability. Okay, and I think that's it. I'm going to hand it over now to my colleague, Dr. Lisel Garavelli.
Thank you, Andra. So now I'm going to present the findings from the chapter 3 of the State of the Science report, which is on the stressor-receptor interaction that we have defined to evaluate the potential environmental effects of marine renewable energy. Next slide, please. So what are the stressors and receptors? Stressors are those parts of a marine renewable energy device or system that may stress or harm the marine environment, and the receptors are the marine animal, the habitats, or the ecosystem processes that could be affected by the stressors. There are 7 key stressor-receptor interactions that have been recognized to understand the potential effects of marine renewable energy development, and you can see these interactions on the figure here. So quickly from top left to bottom right, you can see changes in oceanographic system due, for example, to changes in ocean circulation or wave height. We have effects of underwater noise from marine renewable energy devices on marine animals, effects of electromagnetic field from power cable of marine renewable energy devices on marine animals, entanglement of large marine animals in mooring lines or underwater cable associated with marine renewable energy devices, the risk of collision of marine animal with moving parts of marine renewable energy devices, displacement of marine animals due to the presence of devices, and changes in benthic and pelagic habitat. So today, if you can click, please, Michaela. Today, we are going to only highlight 3 of those interactions: collision risk, underwater noise, and displacement, but you can find all the information on each of those interactions in the chapter 3 of the report. Next slide, please. So first, the risk of collision of marine animals around turbines. So when we talk about turbines, we are talking about a tidal turbine, riverine turbine, or ocean current turbine. So what we know about collision risk is that avoidance behavior is more often documented than evasion. And this is mainly due to the limitation of monitoring technology for evasion behavior. Avoidance behavior is has been mainly observed during turbine operations for fish and marine mammals. For collision, so the contact between the animal and one part of the turbine, moving or not moving, we know that for the fish, collision has rarely been observed during operations of riverine turbines, and for marine mammals and seabird, it has never been observed. When we want to assess collision, numerical models exist to estimate the probability of encounter or collision. However, those models are sensitive to animals' behavior parameters, and they are also very dependent on data availability. There is also a probabilistic approach that has been developed by my colleague Andrea here and her collaborators. This is a framework to move towards the quantification of the likelihood of collision risk, and you can find more details in the chapter. Next slide. So what is the pathway to retire collision risk, and what are the recommendations to move forward to better understand collision risk? Right now, there is a low number of deployments in the water, and it's challenging to observe collision risk events. Potential consequences of even rare events for the animal and associated populations remain uncertain. There is a need to examine and process all existing video datasets if we want to move forward in the better understanding collision risk. There is a need to design research projects geared toward collecting appropriate data for parameterizing and validating models. We need to ensure that monitoring is focused on reducing uncertainty of collision risk. We also need to document and disseminate information on methods or instruments that will provide accurate observations of collision risk. And we also need to continue to update the community, the marine renewable energy community, on the state of the science on collision risk and encourage developers to participate in data collection. Next slide. So now I'm going to present what we know about the risk to marine animals from underwater noise generated by marine renewable energy devices. What we know is that operating devices generate relatively low frequency noise up to 1000 Hertz. And the main receptors for underwater noise are marine mammals, sea turtle, and also some fish and invertebrates that have sensory capabilities for detecting sound or particle motion. There are many new research studies on underwater noise generated by devices or at marine renewable energy project sites that have been completed since 2020. You will see in the report several examples on this project or devices, for example, ISWAC in Italy, or Maramok A5 at BMEC and Mutriku in Spain, or Kilewave or Packwave in the US. So if you want more information, everything is in the report. Next slide. What is the pathway to retire underwater noise, and what are recommendations? So noise levels of marine renewable energy devices, they generally fall below those likely to cause injury or harm. You can see on the left here on the figure, at the bottom, you have the hearing range of several animals, marine animals, and at the top, you have the noise from different source types. In green, there is a marine renewable energy, so current, tidal, or wave. and the frequency is in the middle. And you can see that for the devices, for marine renewable devices, the sound is lower than from other sources. Behavioral changes of animals are unlikely to be attributed solely to marine renewable energy devices. And from everything that we know about underwater noise from operational devices within small-scale marine renewable energy development, we can say that underwater noise can be retired for, for small marine renewable energy devices from 1 to 6. However, each new marine renewable energy device design should be characterized, for example, using IEC 114 technical specification, and there is a need, there are some remaining research needs that need to be resolved, for example, effect from particle motion, but this is not really necessary for consenting processes. Next slide. And the last stressor receptor we wanted to highlight today is displacement of animal from marine renewable energy development. So field observation are essential in understanding the causes or responses and consequences of displacement for each species that can potentially be affected. And hypotheses can be generated for functional group from the available literature that can be gathered from other marine industries. So displacement can be investigating with a combination of numerical models and field-based approach to address remaining knowledge gap. However, field observation have been limited in the absence of large arrays of devices, but the model or analytical frameworks can help assess risk and consequences of displacement. Next slide. Displacement is not an issue for small marine renewable energy projects, so 1 to 6 devices. However, it is important to understand the mechanism and significance of animal displacement as larger projects are planned. Displacement is unlikely to be a priority concern until the deployment of large arrays of marine renewable energy devices. However, it's important to understand the potential mechanisms that cause displacement and possible consequences to the animals. Important to understand also is to generate realistic models for such consequences in combination with stressor-specific models, identify how to best monitor and mitigate those changes, and initiate the monitoring and collection of meaningful field data with the deployment of arrays in mind. So that's all I have for this chapter. Again, everything on all the other stressor receptor interaction is included in the chapter. And next is my colleague, Michaela Freeman.
Thanks, Lizelle. All right, the next 2 chapters are in the section on human dimensions of marine renewable energy. And this is a new section that we've had for the first time in this report. The first is chapter 4 on social and economic effects. And so I'll start by just quickly defining those. There's a variety of coastal and marine industries and community aspects that may experience various social and/or economic effects of MRE, as shown in this illustration here. The economic aspects that may be affected by MRE include employment, existing industries, the cost of electricity, supply chain, and others. And social aspects may include health, safety, well-being, culture, infrastructure, and services. And I also want to note that social aspects can really be quite broad and based on anything that a community or group deems has a social component. So MRE projects have the potential to create significant benefits by stimulating economic growth, generating revenue, creating jobs, improving local infrastructure and services, and providing energy security and resilience. However, if they're not carefully planned and they don't include communities in the development process, there could be adverse effects or changes that don't align with local cultures, values, or the potential to inequitably distribute costs and benefits. So overall, what we found from the literature is that it's been difficult to identify and assess the social and economic effects for MRE, as there's really an absence of regulatory guidance on data collection. Overall, there's limited data, both baseline and long-term monitoring collected to date, and also limited research carried out around MRE projects. And then in general, there's a deficiency of standardization of approaches used for marine renewable energy. While this chapter aimed to focus on MRE-specific literature through a comprehensive literature review, We do incorporate learning and understanding from other marine industries like offshore wind, where we brought in learning, and those industries may be further along or have additional studies that provide some similarities. Overall, gaps in knowledge remain, which mean there's really a need for additional research and data collection around new marine renewable energy projects. One of the main contributions of this chapter to the report is compiling social and economic considerations and effects that have been documented or hypothesized for MRE by groups who may be affected or involved throughout planning, development, and operation of an MRE project. These include fisheries, ports, supply chain, workforce, both indigenous and coastal communities, tourism, conservation, and energy end users. And I just wanted to quickly provide some examples today from these. I won't go into detail due to time, but for instance, for fisheries, the impacts, potential impacts vary significantly by gear type, by typical usage of an area, and the ability of fishers to adapt to new spatial constraints. Some supply chain impacts, these are typically quantified based on economic indicators. And often, though, however, there's a gap where there isn't identification of the economic effects by phase of MRE development, by which industries may be affected, or really allow for comparison across the sector. And additionally, there's really a need to increase the capability and scale of the supply chain as the marine renewable energy industry scales up. And last, communities have specific values, cultures, and histories that really need to be identified. And these are best worked on at the project level and/or community scale. If you're interested in more about each of these groups and how they may affect or be affected by marine energy, definitely check out the report because there's a lot of information there. So this chapter ends with some case studies as well as recommendations. I'll focus on the recommendations today. These we split out by recommendations for different entities to undertake. The first is governments who can help through strategic level planning, such as by developing consistency and requirements and regulations for data collection, conducting and funding long-term assessments and monitoring at a broad spatial scale, and coordinating to help increase understanding of cumulative effects in the marine environment. Research needs that can be achieved by researchers, governments, and other groups and organizations to help fill knowledge gaps and increase the state of the understanding include using transdisciplinary methods, increasing understanding of indicators for MRA-specific effects, applying quality checks for data collection, and standardizing methods that can be applied internationally. Last are needs that will be achieved largely through MRE projects and industry, and this includes applying lessons learned from other industries, improving approaches to address social and economic effects, incorporate justice, equity, and diverse perspectives. And last, bringing together marine activities to comprehensively address these social and economic effects. Overall, from this chapter, we see that there's limited data and information available on marine renewable energy, but there are lessons learned from other industries that can be applied in the meantime, and research from MRE projects has been increasing over the years. So to achieve greater understanding, the broader MRE community will need to come together to share learning and work towards standardization of approaches. The next chapter in the human dimensions section is on stakeholder engagement. So stakeholder engagement is critical, especially projects have the potential to create benefits or negatively impact stakeholders, and also because concerns can drive decisions around siting, environmental monitoring, and energy use. Additionally, as an emerging industry, MRE has the opportunity to intentionally advance social justice and to avoid pitfalls of previous energy transitions or infrastructure projects. Goals for stakeholder engagement should include sharing information on projects, but most importantly, listening to stakeholders, understanding their values and perspectives, and understanding opportunities or barriers for marine energy. We can do this by moving further on the public participation spectrum shown here from one-way information transfer or inform step to two-way dialogue and collaborative partnerships, moving towards that collaborate and empower. What we found through this chapter is there are legal and regulatory frameworks for this sort of stakeholder engagement, but many countries don't have clear guidance for really comprehensive engagement related to marine renewable energy projects. And this may be particularly due to the status of the industry. There's also variability of national policies in different countries, and a lack of uniformity in procedures is considered as one of the main non-technological difficulties for MRA development. Although the knowledge base of successful MRA engagement efforts is growing, there's still a noticeable gap in literature describing post-deployment efforts and ongoing assessments. So Chapter 5 also includes case studies for stakeholder engagement of marine renewable energy. Due to time, I'll move towards the recommendations, but I did want to highlight that we have 3 from this chapter and 3 from the previous chapter as well. So the recommendations for stakeholder engagement include the need to plan for and design a comprehensive approach to stakeholder engagement. This should be tailored based on defined context, community, or location. Need to clarify responsibility and set expectations for that stakeholder engagement. Activities should be conducted early and regularly. And as I mentioned earlier, move beyond informed to those more participatory approaches. Also need to include equity and social and energy justice considerations throughout engagement and throughout all project phases. We also need to apply existing guidance from MRE and other industries on stakeholder engagement that can be particularly helpful to bring in lessons learned and best practices. There's also a need to develop regulatory-based guidance for MRE that goes beyond consultation and can be revisited as the industry moves towards these larger scale developments. And last, we need to increase the knowledge base for MRE and share lessons learned, especially around ongoing and post-engagement activities. So with that, I'm going to move towards the next section of the report, which is on resources to advance marine renewable energy. So starting with Chapter 6, which focuses on strategies to aid consenting processes. There are numerous strategies implemented globally for consenting marine renewable energy projects, which aim to create pathways for responsible development of the industry and to help consenting by being proportionate to the level of uncertainty and risk under consideration. In addition, they may also be helpful to reduce duplication of efforts and resources by applying the wider evidence base. This chapter details 3 strategies: risk retirement, adaptive management, and marine spatial planning. The bulk of the chapter focuses on risk retirement and the work that OES-Environmental has done, and that is what I'll focus on presenting today. So moving towards the scientific information, so the publications available from the industry, some of which we've highlighted in Chapter 3 earlier today, the state of the science reports, and moving those into formats, approaches, and tools for application. So risk retirement is a process for certain interactions. Potential risks may not need to be fully investigated for every project. I do want to note that new MRE projects should be informed by what is already known. This is what we call data transferability. And specifically should note that risk retirement doesn't replace or contradict regulatory processes. And as we heard earlier today, site-specific data may be needed for new projects. Also, that a retired risk can be re-examined in the future, especially as the industry scales up to larger arrays. We developed risk retirement for use during consenting processes by regulators, advisors, developers, and consultants. We also have guidance documents that aim to bridge that scientific evidence to regulatory use and make information easily accessible. And I should note that the risk retirement process, data transferability, and guidance documents are all available at the link at the top of this slide. So OES-Environmental has explored the ability to retire risk for key stressor receptor interactions. You heard about a few of these from Liesel today, and I'll just recap where we're at in the status for risk retirement. So for collision risks, we still require more information before we can consider risk retirement. For underwater noise, electromagnetic fields, changes in habitat, and oceanographic systems, these all can be considered retired for small numbers of devices from 1 to 6. And this is based on a lot of information that's available, as well as consulting with the general MRE community and experts, and all of that's detailed in the report. And of course, I won't have time to go into that today, but that information is all available. Last, for entanglement and displacement, these both need more information as the industry moves to larger scale arrays. So next, there are 8 case studies highlighted in this chapter, and we've shown how these have worked to different parts of this risk retirement process, this image and arrow shown at the top here. So I've highlighted one example here from Maygen, where they work towards retiring changes in habitat. So you'll see we've noted here that they defined their risk as potential impacts to benthic habitat and the animals within those habitats. They've examined existing benthic habitat data. They collected data via benthic survey. And from this, it was noted that monitoring was not required during operational stage of the project. Last, while no mitigation was required during operation, they did have design features and mitigation for construction to mitigate for potential impacts that were identified earlier on in the process. So chapter 6 ends with recommendations. I've highlighted them here for each of those 3 strategies that this chapter covers. For risk retirement and data transferability, developers and consultants should have a willingness to transfer data from MRE projects, research studies, or analogous industries, and to inform projects and consenting processes, and help towards retiring risk. Regulators and advisors should be willing to apply risk retirement data transferability and consenting processes. There's also really a need to develop best management practices for application and continue sharing examples of success and lessons learned. And then there's a need to fund and support research on those remaining risks that aren't yet ripe for retirement, and particularly as we move to larger scale arrays. For adaptive management, we need to identify available resources. So this includes time and funding, et cetera, and to minimize undue financial risk for developers while balancing environmental protections. There's also a need for MRE-specific implementation guidance that includes a strategic understanding on best approaches for applying adaptive management to MRE, how best to reduce uncertainty through discussions between regulators and developers during various project stages, and how best to apply adaptive management at larger scale developments. For marine spatial planning, there needs to be incentives for including marine renewable energy in energy policies and renewable energy goals, and to help create clear objectives for MRE as part of marine spatial planning processes. This can include incorporating practical measures to streamline consenting, increasing available data and tools to inform marine spatial planning development that includes MRE needs and fill knowledge gaps, and also identifying future needs for development based on scale and application. So with that, I'll move to chapter 7. That's the next chapter in this section. It's on education and outreach for environmental effects. This is another new chapter for the 2024 State of the Science report. So education and outreach has the potential about potential environmental effects can help improve understanding of risk to focus research efforts associated with new projects and maximize the benefits of MRE to local communities, which can help achieve clean energy goals. Most people are not familiar with marine renewable energy, with how it works, with how or where it can be used, and the possible benefits of the resource. So this can create a lot of avenues for misinformation or misconceptions, which can increase potentially unnecessary conflicts around proposed projects. There's also a need for training to support development of a new workforce for the MRE industry. Some examples of outreach and educational materials developed by OES-Environmental and others for various audiences, including workforce development activities, are provided in the chapter. And I've also provided a link here to the OES-Environmental page for educational resources. And I'll just linger on this a second in case anyone's interested in using the QR code or the link. All right. So recommendations in this chapter include plans for communicating and disseminating information about MRE, which should be embedded in the research process to assure outreach and education efforts are accurate, current, and appropriately messaged to keep audiences properly informed. Outreach efforts should really be creative with content developed for specific and diverse audiences. And last, workforce development efforts will need to be undertaken with an eye to leveraging resources and lessons learned internationally, as well as from the offshore wind industry. And they also should include more programs at all education levels to increase MRE awareness and develop skills. So with that, I will hand it off to Lynette.
Thank you, Michaela. I am now covering the last chapter on the section about resources to advance marine energy. And so this one is on data on information system and was written by our colleague Hailey Farr. Next slide. Thank you, Michaela. So as more marine energy projects are being deployed on around the world, there is a large amount of data that's being collected, both environmental data and technical data, and as well as all sorts of information. And so we need to make sure that this data and information are accessible widely for the community and easily findable, so that people can make informed decisions. And so several groups have come together to develop hubs for gathering data or information at a national level or international level. And you have here on the right side an example of one of these hubs developed for the US. And so it's a platform that enables to host and disseminate data and information in a variety of formats. So the US one is called Primer, for Portal and Repository for Information on Marine Renewable Energy. And it's a central system for MRE data, information on resources in the US. You have the link here up top, as well as a QR code to get to that hub. It's made of different interfaces like TSIS Engineering, Marine Energy Atlas, and so on. So you can spend some time exploring it. And it also links to international databases. And the chapter in the report does provide information and links about more hubs internationally. Next slide. So one of the specific platforms that's hosted on Primer is TSIS. And I hope that most of you already attending our webinar today is familiar with TSIS. So it's a knowledge hub that hosts information on resources on the environmental effects of marine energy on wind energy around the world. It doesn't host data per se, just information on resources, and then metadata about projects and so on. It has over 9,000 journal articles, conference papers, reports, webinar recordings, and so on. It's a platform that's designed for the outreach and engagement activities of OES-Environmental. Like this webinar today will be recorded and hosted on TSIS. And so among the content, you can find the event calendars where we list workshops and webinars and so on, archived webinars, most of them with a recording, a page on educational resources, some of them that Michaela just presented a few slides ago. All the environmental metadata that we have been able to gather about marine energy projects around the world, as well as archives of the TSIS Blast newsletter. It's a newsletter that is sent every other week. And if you are not already familiar with it, I invite you to go on the TSIS website and subscribe for this newsletter, because it provides a lot of up-to-date information. Next slide. So now we are moving on to the one to last section of the report, this one called Beyond Stressor Receptor Interactions. And so the chapter 3 that Lisa presented earlier will summarize information that we know up to date about effects around single devices up to 6 devices. But the industry is at a stage now where it's time to start looking beyond 6 devices and more at the large arrays on broader ecosystem effects. So this is what this chapter was about. Next slide. So the chapter looked at specifically three topics. The first one being scaling our knowledge of environmental effects from single marine energy devices to arrays of devices. And so we have seen lots of investigations of interactions at small number of devices, 1 to 6 usually. But because we don't have large arrays in the water yet, there is very little known about potential effects at this large scale. We define large arrays as 10 to 30 devices, depending on the size of the device, the array geometry, the ambient environment, the configuration, and so on. And so with this section of the chapter, we wanted to know how to apply the knowledge that we've acquired at single devices around stressor receptor interactions, and how to translate that to large-scale arrays. And so we used some of the definitions from the cumulative effects science to define how the environmental effects could translate, like dominance of a single device over all the other devices in the array, or on additive effects of all the devices, antagonistic effects of some devices, or synergistic effects. So you can see on this table our hypothesis for each of the stressor receptor interactions that Andrea and Lisa presented earlier today. Next slide. The next topic in this chapter was about ecosystem approach on how to place the different single stressor receptor interactions of marine energy in a broader context of the whole ecosystem. And so the ecosystem approach is an approach that has been used in other industries like offshore wind or fisheries, but has not been used very much for marine energy. And so we looked at how to apply this approach into the marine energy context. And especially we defined conceptual frameworks for global qualitative analysis to describe the interactions between the ecosystem components and the marine energy systems. And so you can see on this graphic on the right, the potential interactions between marine energy systems on various levels of a trophic structure on ecosystem functions. And we also assessed the different models and indicators that are used in the ecosystem approach and that could be applicable to marine energy. Next slide. And the last topic in this chapter was about cumulative effects on how do potential environmental effects of marine energy can cumulate with those of other human activities at sea in the area where a project is developed. And so we looked at the direct and indirect effects from variety of activities that occur within the region, including marine energy, and developed some hypotheses of what the cumulative effects of marine energy development would be, what are the different forms of cumulative effect that it could take, as those listed here on the graph on the right, like additive, dominant, antagonistic, and so on. And then we also looked at the different means of investigating cumulative effects. Next slide, Michaela. Thank you. And so then the chapter concludes with recommendations for around all three of the topics on how we can move from single interactions around single devices to a system-wide effect, a perspective around arrays. And so we need to improve our understanding of physical and biological processes, ecosystem characteristics, and social economic factors of marine energy development areas. We need to identify marine energy-specific data gaps that prevent applying this system-wide approach that I just described. We also need to consider the uncertainty in all the modeling efforts that would be used, and especially how to convey that uncertainty to stakeholders. We also need to adapt that system-wide investigation to various life stages of a marine energy project. And most importantly, we need to identify thresholds in responses for each of the stressor receptor interactions that we've been presenting so far. Next slide. So the second chapter in this section, beyond stressor receptor interactions, is about tropical and subtropical ecosystem and the development of marine renewable energy in these ecosystems. Next. So marine energy devices so far have been deployed mostly in temperate ecosystem and especially in the northern hemisphere. And so we felt like it was time to look at a potential environmental effect and concerns from tropical and subtropical ecosystem, because more and more countries in those areas are adding marine energy or considering adding marine energy to their energy mix. And so we used some surveys on interviews to collect information on knowledge about environmental concerns and socioeconomic concerns. And so there is a need to better understand how environmental effects may differ between tropical and subtropical regions from those in temperate regions. Marine renewable energy resources in those regions often overlap with biodiversity hotspots, like high biodiversity hotspots. And so the development of marine energy may affect unique habitats that are already experiencing the impact of climate change, like the coral reef, the mangrove forest, the seagrass beds. And so it's important to look at the effects on the biodiversity on ecosystem functions more than single stressor receptor interactions. On the socioeconomic side, some of the concerns from the local communities are around the emphasis on social acceptance on potential economic impacts of marine energy. So this is a nice parallel with what Michaela presented earlier about chapter 4. And so some of the examples that are specific to tropical and subtropical areas are local and indigenous community concerns. For example, in Chile, there is a legal exclusive access right to coastal areas and resources to indigenous communities. In Japan, for example, a marine energy project can only be consented if it has gone through an agreement process with local fisheries communities. And another concern in Indonesia is around tourism, and the concern that development of large farms of tidal energy could potentially disrupt the distribution of the sunfish, which could impact the scuba diving and tourism industry. Next slide. So some recommendations about tropical and subtropical areas, that it's important to identify the priority on vulnerable habitats in these ecosystems. There is some long-term baseline monitoring and modeling studies that have been done already in other contexts, and so marine energy needs to combine those. It's important to apply a system effect from the start, and especially look at cumulative effects on an ecosystem approach, and also engage early on local government bodies and non-governmental organizations to identify concerns from local communities. And so collaborate with local stakeholders to collect environmental data should be a non-brainer. And then MRE technologies need to be developed in an environmental friendly ways to be part of the ecosystem, and also be adapted to extreme events like hurricanes that are much more common in tropical and subtropical areas. And then I move it on to Liesel, who will wrap us up.
Thank you, Nine. So this is our last chapter, chapter 11, which summarizes everything we have in the report. I'm obviously not going to do that now because you heard everything from my colleagues and I. And we also mentioned the paths forward for OES-Environmental. So just one small wrap-up sentence. The 2024 State of the Science report includes an introduction, a look ahead, this chapter 11, and 9 chapters that provide details of research and monitoring findings on environmental effects of marine renewable energy, identify gaps in knowledge, and list recommendations to address these gaps. Next slide. So in chapter 11, we are mentioning the new phase of OES-Environmental. This new phase just started, and will last up to 2028. So in this new phase, phase 5 of OES-Environmental, we are going to continue with collecting, analyzing, disseminating the information on environmental effects of marine renewable energy. And we are also going to start working or to continue working on some of this topic, but I'm going to talk about those. We are going to have 4 main topics we are going to tackle. The first one is environmental acceptability. And here we are going to look into existing knowledge on environmental effects to be used for proactive developer guidance on design, deployment, operation, maintenance, and decommissioning of devices. And we also are going to look into the potential net positive impact of marine renewable energy devices in this work. We are also going to work on environmental effects of off-grid marine renewable energy application. So by off-grid here, we mean, for example, application for remote communities or islands. And we will examine differences between the potential effects of grid scale and off-grid devices generally smaller that are generally smaller and fewer. We will continue to work on system-wide effects, which is what Linek just presented, and we will continue to examine the effects of scaling to arrays, effects on ecosystem, cumulative effects with other human activities in face of climate change, and the effects in tropical and subtropical ecosystem. And finally, we will work also on social and economic effects of marine renewable energy. Michaela presented some of our work today. Those effects are inextricably linked to environmental effects of marine renewable energy. However, there is a need to have more standardized methods to better understand the social and economic effects. So we will work on that. Next slide, please. So in conclusion, we do have a better understanding of the potential marine renewable energy environmental effects. However, we have realized that this understanding is more complex than anticipated. Many countries lack regulatory pathways for marine renewable energy deployment, including monitoring and mitigating environmental effects. We have extensive insight that has been gained on the stressor-receptor interaction of marine renewable energy with animals, habitat, and ecosystem processes. However, for some of these interactions, there is more that needs to be learned. We do have a global network of researchers, developers, regulators, and other stakeholders that do work on environmental effect of marine renewable energy. You probably saw in the chat a bunch of other groups in the world that who work on environmental effects, and we all collaborate together. OES-Environmental acts as a collaboration to assist with development of a sustainable marine renewable energy industry. This is what we are doing here with the release of this 2024 report. We also have a 2016 State of the Science report and a 2020 State of the Science report that are all available on TSIS. Next slide, please. So thank you very much for your attention. I want to specifically thank my colleague here, Andrea, Linek, and Michaela, for today's webinar and for their work. And we also want to thank all the authors and contributors from the Pacific Northwest National Laboratory who have helped us developing this report for the past 4 years, I guess. So we want to thank Debbie Rose, Haley Farr, Christine Jones, Marley Kaplan, and Jonathan Whiting. We also want to thank all the international authors and contributors who have worked with us to develop this report, and there are many. And we want to thank Ocean Energy System and the US Department of Energy, Water, Power Technologies Office for their support. If you haven't read yet the 2024 State of the Science report, you can see on the right at the top, there is the hyperlink and there is a QR code. We also have an executive summary, so high-level summary of the report, and also 14 short science summaries that summarize the finding from most of those chapters. So if you don't feel like reading a very long chapter, there will be a short science summary that highlights the main information. And please, if you have a few minutes after our webinar, we do have a survey. We would love to hear from you. We would love to have your feedback on our presentation today. And also maybe if you have any suggestion for other presentation, we would love to hear from you. So I will hand to Michaela next, who will do the Q&A. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Lizelle. I will just give a quick reminder for the Q&A. Please put your questions in the question and answer box. It allows us to more easily view your questions, and also we will do our best to respond to everyone's question either during this Q&A period or with a typed answer. So please put your questions there. If you want to have notes on collaboration or any notes for us or share resources, those can go in the meeting chat box. So with that, we have a lot of great questions today. I'll start off with one. We seem to have a good offshore wind crowd here. So I wanted to start there. And I wanted to invite maybe Andrea as well to come back on video. So I do want to note that marine renewable energy, MRE, as we talk about in this report, includes wave, tide, current, large rivers, salinity gradient, and thermal energy or thermal gradient. It does not include offshore wind. And so a lot of the information we have can be transferred and is similar, but there's also learning that can't. So I'll go through some questions and see if my collaborators here want to add some information. So the first is we have several offshore wind farms in operation now, have baseline data and monitoring been supplied to researchers and regulators as planned, and has it provided guidance on how to properly adapt to additional development? As I mentioned, we're focused on marine renewable energy, so we're happy to answer this question from that perspective, and I think a lot of that learning can be shared. So Andrea, anyone want to take a stab at that one, or do you want me to start?
I was just going to say, I put in the answered questions, in response to a question from Kathleen Sace, I put 4 links of information on offshore wind, everything from how do we use sort of information from land-based to offshore wind, baseline information, etc. And so if you check that out, I think you'll find a good deal of information there. But as Michaela said, there are portions of what we've talked about today, the vast majority, quite honestly, that are very applicable to offshore wind. The scale may be somewhat different, but if you think about environmental effects of EMF from cables on animals, very, very similar, obviously, underwater noise, etc. Probably the collision risk is the biggest difference. We're talking about collisions in air with birds and bats for wind. We're talking about marine mammals and fish and sea turtles underwater for tidal. But check out those 4 links, and I think you'll find a lot of what you are looking for.
Great, thanks, Andrea. And I think everyone can see the question and answer box. If you toggle between open and answered, you'll see those answers that Andrea was talking about. And I also put those links in the chat so everyone can easily access them there as well. So another question we have is, someone has considered marine renewable energy areas as de facto MPAs, marine protected areas, but is this really accurate? If we change the boundary conditions of the ecosystem, we have potential to change the basic structure and function of that ecosystem. And so are we creating new habitats that have potential to change? And is this discussed? So I think maybe go over. Andrea, you want to take that, or Linnae for changes in habitat?
Linnae, you start. This could be a webinar series in itself. Why don't you start?
Yes, there is a lot to say about this. I think what we mean by de facto MPAs, marine protected area, is that usually fishing is prohibited around marine energy devices because of risk of entanglement of fishing gear on damage to marine energy devices or damage to fishing boat, fishing gears. And so because of that, fish species and others can grow without human pressure. And so you get a much more greater abundance of fish species around marine energy devices. And that has been observed first around offshore wind turbines. And so that's what is meant by de facto MPAs. But there is the understanding that those habitats are different from what was in the area initially because you put artificial structures, oftentimes in habitats that were soft bottom, did not have much of a hard substrate. And so you do initially change the habitat and then provide a new habitat and turn it into a reserve. That's a short version, I would say.
Yeah, and I'd just like to add the whole idea of whether creating MPAs does some of the things that we'd like them to do is a highly controversial topic. And I hear from developers quite often that they would like to get credit, if you will, for creating either de facto MPAs or new habitat. Our regulatory system doesn't work that way with, pluses and minuses. But I think it is an active area of study both in fisheries and in this field. So yeah, it's not going to be a simple answer, I guess.
Thanks for those answers. All right, the next question. So someone asked, we are starting the process of studying the environmental conditions baseline assessments for our proposed project, and we were wondering what would be the best way to start early collaboration with this community. I'm happy to take this one unless, okay, Andrea, you're highlighted green, so I can't tell if that means you're you're talking or not. So, okay, great, perfect. So, for this one, I think that is a challenging question where to start. I think it depends on a lot of project-specific factors, which is something we talk about in our stakeholder engagement chapter of this report. One way that you can start with the community, I'm taking the community as the local community. However, I do understand you could be talking about the research community, the regulators, and others. So there, I think, are a few different ways to respond to this question. But if you're talking about the local community, a great way is if you're not already involved and engaged with that community or you don't live within that community, is to find a group who is already doing some of that work and partner with someone who's already invested in the community, has already engaged, and use that as a way for early collaboration to understand who the local players are, who's important to engage with, who the different groups are, and maybe some perspectives from past infrastructure projects that could be important to acknowledge for marine renewable energy development. There's a lot more I could say on that, but I want to make sure we get to some more questions. So I'll refer you to that stakeholder engagement chapter and just want to take a sec if anyone else wants to add on to that okay, perfect. All right, so this question, sorry, I'm looking for the original one, which is about net positive impacts. And so someone asked if we were discussing net positive, does the analysis and report consider these net positive impacts? Are developers working towards net positive impacts, which potentially makes an argument to not decommission subsurface assets? And was that reviewed as part of this work? So I'll hand that to Andrea or Lizelle.
I'll start, then give it to Lyselle if you like.
Yeah.
Okay, so we have not looked at net positive impact per se. As Lyselle mentioned at the very end, as we move into our new phase, we will begin to look at, we've had many discussions about what to call it, environmental acceptability, net positive impact. marine net zero, etc. We will be looking more at this. We did not to date, but there are a number, and partly State of the Science is based on publicly available information. So we've used published papers, reports, etc. And as most of you know, there's not an awful lot of literature out on net positive impact yet, but it is really rolling now. So we will be looking at that. There are a number of places I think you could look. There's been some really good work done in the decommissioning question in the North Sea. But we are looking forward to this, and we are also looking forward to any collaborations on this. We're hearing very broad definition of net positive, including if you mitigate something, it's a net positive impact. I question that. I think you're just not making it worse. So we are looking forward to a lot of collaboration in this space. So Lisel.
I just want to note that I think it's something that we heard from more the internal, like from a US perspective. We heard this from more the international community, and it's I don't think we are here yet in the US, but we are very interested in the question. So we're happy to learn from anyone else. So if you have any information, we would love to have it. My email is there, but we also have everybody else's email, like, if you want to contact everyone. And we have also the thesis@pnnl.gov email, if you want to reach out to us with any information.
Wonderful. Thanks both. I do see there's a question on if the presentation will be available after the webinar. So I just wanted to share with everyone that we are recording this and it will be available on TETHIS webpage on the webinar page. We'll put a link in the chat for that. And we'll have both a PDF of the slide deck as well as a recording. Both of those should hopefully be up by the end of the week. And when they are, we'll send a reminder note out to anyone who's registered for the webinar. So if you're here today, you'll get that reminder. All right. I see that this was answered in the Q&A box, but I just wanted to give our authors a chance to kind of expand on it a little bit. So someone asked if there's a comprehensive overview of current installations of MRE globally and planned MRE installations. So I'll pass that to Andrea and Leneg, authors of chapter 2.
Yeah, I answered that one, and basically what I forgot to say was if you go to TETHIS, the TETHIS metadata, which somebody's put in the chat somewhere or other, we call them metadata forms. They are a record of every device we can find that's ever been in the water, and we're going back 15 years at least, for which there's been any environmental work done. And this was the basis upon which we reviewed projects around the world and chose those. There were 86 of them out of 150 or so that we felt had adequate environmental effects work done around them. There is no compilation, to our knowledge, of every device that's ever been in the water. Or one other resource you might look at, Leneg mentioned Primer, our US data and information system. There is a knowledge hub called the Projects Database, which has over 1,000 entries. They are not all active projects, obviously, but you can cross-reference companies, device type, location, and then you'll find out whether they've been operational, planned, etc. So those are a couple of resources to kind of get at what's been done. Leneg.
I would also add that so chapter 2 in the State of the Science report does describe a lot of these projects around the world, but Andrea and I, and with the co-authors from the chapter, also
Leneg, you're
wrote a journal article that's published in Marine Technology Society Journal.
Hey, Leneg, turn off your camera because you're
details about.
We can't really understand you. Your internet's bad.
What's up?
Yeah. Okay. Say that again because you were
sorry.
in and out.
Yeah. Apologies for that. I have bad connections today. I was saying that the chapter 2 of the report that Andrea presented at the beginning of the webinar summarizes some of the marine our knowledge about marine energy development around the world on those that have done environmental monitoring. But Andrea, our co-authors, and I also wrote a journal article in Marine Technology Science Society Journal that has more details about those deployments. The chapter was more of a summarized version of that journal article. So I can put the link in the chat. It's behind a paywall. So if you don't have access, please reach out to Andrea or myself and we can share the
All right. Thanks, Lene. Apologies for the technical difficulties, having some internet issues there, but hopefully I think everyone got the information and Lene will put a link in the chat for everyone. All right. The next question I have is how can the baseline be defined in obviously very dynamic and changing environments? This is a great question. Andrea, do you want to start on that one? You're muted.
I'm sorry, Michaela. Sorry, what question?
Oh, no problem. How can the baseline be defined in obviously very dynamic and changing environments?
Yeah, I saw that question. It's another one of those very big philosophical questions we could spend a lot of time on. I think this worries a lot of us. What does a changing baseline mean? And when we say that was sort of shorthand when we said you need a baseline of some sort, I think you could almost say what you need is an inventory, at the least, of habitats and animals who are in the area. It is very, very difficult to really create a baseline and then go in and say you've had baseline changes. Anyone who's tried to do backheat before after uh, experiments in the marine environment will know this. So although a baseline is necessary, I think we can't get too hung up on putting huge resources into figuring out exactly what is there and what processes are happening now. I think we have to have a good sense of the receiving water into which projects are placed in order to understand what to study, what to monitor for potential interactions, and to understand if there have been large-scale changes. Not a very satisfying answer, but I think that's sort of my personal opinion of where we are. Anyone else?
That's great. That's a big and challenging one to answer for sure. All right. I see we have a question that Andrea's responded to, and I'll just point to, I think there's some links. We might have mentioned it earlier, but I see it again in the open question. So it's a question about has anyone extrapolated from land-based wind turbines to open water for burn impacts? And just wanted to know, Andrea mentioned there's work been done and provided some resources. They're both in the chat and in the answered part of the questions. And someone also put a link as well there. Okay, another question we have. Someone asked if there will be opportunities to work with OES-Environmental in their studies, and I just wanted to take a few minutes to note some of the ways in which we do try and engage with folks in different aspects, whether that's the MRE community, regulators, and whatnot. So from time to time, we'll hold expert forums, some of which we did in the lead up to this report. We held one on social and economic effects. And so we invited those working on social and economic effects of marine renewable energy to be involved in our expert forum and have discussions that inform the chapter 4 of the report. We also are doing workshops at conferences that help inform studies, and we're also open to collaboration if people want to reach out to us. Anyone else from the team want to add anything else there? Great. And I should also note that OES-Environmental consists of, as Andrea mentioned, 16 countries, each with a country representative. And so if you have a country representative in your country, it's great to reach out to that person if you're interested in collaboration or working with them as well. Everyone who is a country representative is noted on the TETHIS website. And I do want to note we're moving into phase 5, so we need to re-up all the country representatives, and we'll have that information online as soon as we can, probably in the next month or so. Thanks, Lizelle. Lizelle put a link to our OES-Environmental, about OES-Environmental page on TETHIS. Another question I saw come through was, do you plan to develop more outreach materials for this new report? That's a great question. We released the report, little sigh of relief for having it out there, and then we turned to outreach for the report and getting the word out and sharing the information. We already have a few formats that are available. One I want to note is we have an executive summary for the report, and that is available in actually 8 languages. It's available on TETHIS. We want to give a huge shout out to our country representatives and other members of the OES-Environmental team for providing those additional languages so that we have those available. We also have short science summaries of most chapters in the State of the Science report. These are 2-pagers that condense down the information. These are great kind of high level documents to hand out, to share, whether it's to regulators, to community members, and we hope that people use them in their marine renewable energy projects and research that they're doing. We've also are starting a social media campaign where we're posting about each of the chapters and every subsection in chapter 3 on stressor receptor interactions. I think we might have started it a day or two ago, I think on Monday, and we'll continue it, I think, all the way through the beginning of December. So check on our social media accounts, Twitter, well, I guess X, Instagram, and Facebook. You can find all that information. And then we'll continue to do some additional outreach from there. So stay tuned for additional materials. We'll have those available. If you're signed up for the TETHIS Blast, they'll likely come through that channel. Anything else to add?
I would just note, and Laura added it on the chat, but for those of you who are in Europe, Andrea and I are going to be at Ocean Energy Europe, and we will have a workshop there, and we will also, given a high-level summary of the report but we are going to tackle more about some specific stressor receptor interactions. So we hope to see you there if you are, and it's in Aviemore, Scotland.
Wonderful. Thank you, Lizelle, and thanks, Lotta, for putting that in the chat. Because I already talked about it, I'll just quickly answer this question in the chat. How do we get informed of these other workshops or meetings leading up to the reports? Can we join and listen and contribute as appropriate? So I do want to note we publish this report every 4 years. So the lead up to the reports usually start 2 years out, a year and a half out. So if we're working back from September 2028, start keeping an eye on things 2 years out from that. And look for announcements. A lot of these opportunities will come through in the TETHIS Blast, whether they're workshops at conferences or online events. Some of the expert forums are by invitation only, and so we reach out to country representatives to ask for experts working in those fields. So also just connect with us through the country representatives, and I think that's the best way to join those. Anything I missed? Great. Okay. Going back to the Q&A box, so one person asked, it is anticipated that future MRE projects will combine multiple device types, so underwater turbines, buoy devices, I assume that's WEX, or is it advantageous for projects to utilize a single device type? If multiple device types are used, how do you anticipate that will affect the environmental impacts of permitting processes? That's a great question. Lisa, go ahead.
I can quickly say that every information we have so far, this is with one type of devices, and what we hear is I think it's already complicated enough to permit one single type of device. So we haven't really looked into, and so far, as far as I know, I don't think there are any project looking at combining a tidal turbine and a wave energy converter. Anybody else?
No, I think the ones where you're absolutely right, but I think the ones that are more likely are putting wave and wind together. There's been a lot of discussion of that. And how will this work? That's a really good question. Obviously, it's going to differ by country. I know in the US, the way that wave and wind are permitted because of the agencies involved are kind of different. So it's a very good question, and it hasn't really been faced from a regulatory point of view. From the environmental point of view, my guess is you're going to have to bring information for each type of device together and then also look at sort of the overlap. The closest I think we've come to seeing this is the Maychan project in Scotland. It's all tidal, but there's actually two different types, two different companies' devices that are deployed there. And they actually look kind of similar though. So we haven't tackled this, quite frankly, and I think we're going to have to in future. It's a little bit daunting, at least from our perspective. We've looked somewhat at some of the teammates here at marine energy and aquaculture. And those come from very different permitting pathways, at least in this country. And it looks quite daunting of how to do this. So it's something that as a community, I think we should start thinking about. There's a lot of talk of these hybrid devices. So guess we'll have to look in the future.
I'll
And
maybe just go ahead, Linnea.
I will add to that that with the new phase of OES-Environmental, one of the tasks that we will tackle is to continue looking at the scaling up side of environmental effects from single devices to arrays, and we'll look at case studies or rather use cases, hypothetical use cases, and so hybrid array like that could be something we start looking into on assets, the different environmental impacts on type of modeling that would be required on this kind of things. If you are interested in this task, please reach out and we can start chatting offline.
Thanks, Linnea. I was just going to add that I think we have some examples of multiple different technologies of the same device type. So like wave energy devices at PacWave, they used kind of a permitting envelope for like multiple different wave energy devices that were uncertain. So while it's not exactly the different, tidal turbine wave energy devices, I think there's some learning that we can bring in to look at those different aspects. All right, so another question. I probably have time for this, might be our last question. Someone is concerned that the most of the monitoring work has been done around single devices, and impacts from single devices are usually negligible, but in an array, this can change. There's some additional context there, but I think that's enough to have a response to that. So, Andrea, you want to start us off?
Yeah, sure. So, yeah, Juan, I think we're all worried about this. And I agree entirely with the questioner that we need to employ our modeling tools to really understand how we might go from single devices to multiples. And I think the paper and the chapter in the report on scaling up from single devices to arrays really starts to give some insight. We have to think about um, adding devices create additive effects? Will they be multiplicative? Will they be synergistic? And models can take us a long way along that lines, but we do need the data from multiple devices from arrays in order to validate those. I think that underwater noise is one of the easier ones because we have a lot of modeling tools that just need to be validated for this specific use. But some of the others, I think collision risk is the one that keeps me up nights. Does an animal come and see 30 turbines as 30 different points of danger, or do they avoid a whole area? These are the things that we really need to be investigating. So, yeah. Linnea, do you want to add to that?
Just add that I put in the chat link to the article that our colleague Dan Hasselman, who's a Canada OES environmental rep, published with us last year on scaling up to arrays. And I'd like to add
Lene, you're cutting in and out again, so either
yes,
try turn.
modeling is gonna be
Lene,
the
sorry,
main.
unfortunately, we can't hear you. So if you have anything to add,
Sorry,
Lene, if you'll just put your comments in the chat, that would be great. Sorry, your internet is not coming through right now. Um, with that, apologies for having to cut that answer short, but Lene will put some notes in the chat. I just want to thank everyone so much for joining us today. We know the State of the Science report is a hefty report, but we really hope you check it all out. As a reminder, we have an executive summary, we have short science summaries, and then the full report. So please take a look at all the information we've supplied there. And we want to thank you. A reminder that the slides and a recording will be available on THESIS later this week. And we look forward to continuing to engage with everyone and work together in this next phase of OES-Environmental. So thank you, everyone. We'll stay on the line for just a second or two more as we finish typing answers in the question and answer box and get everything answered. So thank you so much. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
And I'll just note for those still on, Lene said, please check out a paper on scaling up that she put in the chat in chapter 9 of the State of the Science report. All right, thanks everyone.